There's a quiet misunderstanding about Christmas that settles in every year, almost politely, like snow that looks clean until you realize how cold it really is. We tell ourselves it's a season of joy, of warmth, of togetherness, and yet, if we're honest with ourselves, for many people it becomes a season where absence speaks louder than music, where silence sits heavier than any ornament on the tree. What nobody likes to admit is that Christmas doesn't create love, it reveals it. It turns the volume up on what was already there, the patience we practiced all year or didn't, the grace we extended or withheld, the conversations we postponed, the apologies we meant to make when things slowed down. And when the world finally pauses just enough for us to feel those unfinished things, that's when the ache shows up. Not because something is wrong with us, but because love was asking something of us long before the lights came on. In the early years of this century, especially after the shocks and reckonings that followed the late 2000s, I watched how quickly life accelerated. Phones became extensions of our hands. Work followed us home. Even rest began to feel productive only if it could be measured or shared. And Christmas, once a natural pause, slowly turned into another deadline, another performance, another test of whether we were keeping up. We wrapped gifts faster than we wrapped our arms around each other. We sent messages instead of showing up. We told ourselves we were too tired, too busy, too stretched, and most days that was true. But beneath that exhaustion lived something deeper, a fear that if we slowed down long enough to be present, we might have to feel things we'd been avoiding. Grief, regret, loneliness, or the quiet realization that love, real love, was going to ask more of us than we'd planned to give. Because here's the part nobody puts on a greeting card. Love is work, not the kind that gets applause, not the kind that trends. It's the daily surrender of comfort, staying when leaving would be easier, listening when you'd rather be understood, giving when you're already running low. And when that work goes unseen, when it isn't named or shared, it can harden into resentment. I've seen it in families who sit at the same table but live worlds apart. I've seen it in leaders who confuse authority with connection. I've felt it myself in moments when responsibility crowded out reflection. Yet Christmas, in its quiet wisdom, keeps whispering the same inconvenient truth, that love empties itself in order to be filled, that presence matters more than perfection, that a meal shared can do more healing than 1,000 well-intended posts. And in a time when our democracy strains under the weight of division, when trust feels fragile and people retreat into corners that feel safer, that message carries moral weight. Because a society that forgets how to show up for one another in ordinary rooms, around ordinary tables, will struggle to show up when it matters most. So the question becomes harder than we expect. Not whether we believe in love. Almost everyone says they do. The real question, the one Christmas quietly asks us each year, is whether we're willing to practice it when no one is watching, when it costs us time, when it asks us to sit in discomfort instead of scrolling past it. And if we're not, what does that say about the kind of people and the kind of nation we're becoming? When I was younger, I used to think love announced itself, that it arrived with certainty, with clarity, with a kind of unmistakable glow. But over time, watching families in Chicago, listening to neighbors who carried more than their share of worry, later sitting with leaders who bore the weight of decisions that followed them home, I learned something quieter and truer. Love rarely declares itself. It shows up, and it keeps showing up. Christmas has always understood that better than we do. Long before it became a season of shopping carts and shipping deadlines, it was a story about presence in an inhospitable world, about choosing closeness in the cold, about humility over spectacle. In a way, it was never meant to be easy. It was meant to interrupt us, to slow us down just enough to notice who was missing, who was hurting, who had been holding things together alone. In the years after the financial shocks of the late 2000s, I watched how strain seeped into living rooms. Jobs became uncertain. Homes felt less stable. Families learned to stretch emotionally as much as economically. And even as recovery came in fits and starts, something else lingered. A fatigue that made connection feel optional instead of essential. Christmas arrived each year not as relief, but as pressure. Expectations stacked on top of exhaustion. Smiles asked to cover wounds that hadn't healed. At the same time, our culture told a convincing story that independence was strength, that needing others was weakness, that vulnerability should be carefully curated or hidden altogether. Screens made it easier to perform joy without practicing it. We could be everywhere and nowhere at once. And so the hearth, that ancient symbol of gathering, grew quieter, not because people stopped caring, but because caring began to feel heavy. Yet even in those moments, I saw another story unfolding. A single parent cooking a modest meal and inviting neighbors so no one would eat alone. An elder choosing to forgive a grievance that had lasted longer than it should have. Volunteers opening community halls on the coldest nights, not because it was convenient, but because it was right. These acts didn't make headlines, they didn't fix everything, but they did something more enduring. They reminded people that love isn't an emotion you wait for, it's a decision you make. Again and again. I've sat at tables where phones stayed in pockets and stories finally surfaced. Where laughter arrived late, a little rusty, but real. I've watched leaders admit weariness, not as weakness, but as an invitation for others to rest too. Those moments taught me that trust isn't built in grand speeches. It's built in ordinary honesty, in shared silence, in the courage to say, I'm here, and mean it. And there's a moral dimension to that choice we don't talk about enough. Because when people feel unseen, unheard, unheld, they don't just withdraw from relationships, they withdraw from community, from civic life, from the shared work of democracy. A nation is not held together by laws alone. It's held together by habits of care, by the simple assurance that someone will notice if you're gone. That's why Christmas still matters, even maybe especially now. Not as nostalgia, not as obligation, but as a quiet test of who we're willing to be when the pace slows and the truth gets louder. Will we reach for distraction or for each other? Will we measure love by what's under the tree or by who's sitting beside it? And as you listen to this, I wonder what conversations have you been postponing and what kind of courage would it take to begin them before the season passes? When I think about what Christmas teaches us about love, the part nobody really talks about, I keep coming back to restraint, the discipline of staying, the humility of lowering yourself enough to meet another person where they are, not where you wish they'd be. Love, at its most honest, is inefficient. It takes time you don't feel you have. It asks patience when your nerves are already thin. It calls you to listen when you'd rather retreat. And in a culture that measures success by speed and scale, that kind of love can feel almost subversive. But I've learned in community halls, in crisis meetings, in the Oval Office late at night, that restraint is not weakness. It is strength that refuses to dominate. Democracy depends on that kind of love more than we like to admit, not the sentimental kind, the practiced kind, the kind that says every voice matters, even when it's inconvenient, the kind that sits through discomfort instead of walking away. When citizens learn to be present with one another, truly present, they carry that muscle into public life. They compromise more honestly. They disagree without dehumanizing. They stay engaged when outcomes disappoint. I've seen what happens when that muscle atrophies. People harden. Communities fracture. Fear fills the gaps where trust used to live. And no amount of policy can repair that alone. Laws can protect rights, but only love, disciplined, practiced love can sustain a shared future. Christmas doesn't solve this for us. It simply holds up a mirror. It reminds us that progress is slow, imperfect, and deeply human. That healing happens one table, one conversation, one act of presence at a time. That hope isn't naive optimism, it's the decision to keep showing up even when the world gives you reasons not to. I think of the neighbor who bakes one extra pie, the family that makes room for grief instead of hiding it, the volunteer who wraps gifts for someone they'll never meet. These aren't grand strategies. They're small, stubborn acts of faith in one another, and stitched together, they form something powerful enough to carry a society through winter, literal and metaphorical. So as the lights glow and the season hums around us, I hope we pause long enough to ask ourselves a few quiet questions. Who needs my presence more than my perfection? Where have I replaced connection with convenience? And what would change in my home, my community, even my country, if I chose to show up fully, just once, more than I planned to? If these questions resonate with you, I'd invite you to share your reflections in the comments, not answers polished for display, but honest ones. And if you found value in sitting with these thoughts, consider subscribing so we can keep having these conversations together. Because in the end, love isn't proven by what we say this season, it's proven by what we're willing to stay for.